morning. This is a video to go over the brain ID diagrams to kind of look at the different parts of the brain and talk a little bit about what each of those structures actually does for our body. We divided the brain into roughly 6 different regions. So different textbooks might count this a little bit differently, but in general, we're going to have 6 regions: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon region, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Some books are going to combine the midbrain, pons, and medulla into one structure called the brainstem, but each one of those sections of the brainstems actually has a very distinct job, so we're going to separate them out. This is a picture looking at the brain from an inferior viewpoint. So again, you can see the cerebrum is the main part of your brain. When you think about a brain and visualize that, you're most likely picturing the cerebrum. The cerebellum is going to be located towards the back part of your brain, the posterior part of the brain. And then the brainstem, which would be made up of, again, your pons, your medulla, and then your diencephalon region, which is not visible in this particular photo. So we're going to start with the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the main part of your brain. It's going to make up the most mass in your brain. And the cerebrum is divided into lobes, each lobe with a very specific function or a job or controls a certain thing in your nervous system. So we'll start with the temporal lobe. Then temporal lobe is going to be located beneath the lateral fissure on both cerebral hemispheres of the brain. So it's on both sides. Think of the temporal bone, right? This part of your brain, the temporal lobe, is going to sit right behind it. It is involved in processing sensory input into meaningful things. So, looking at something and then associating it with a memory that we might have. It's also involved in the retention of visual memories, language comprehension, and also emotion association. So inside this lobe is the hippocampus, which is associated with forming new memories and learning new things. It's something that we will talk about here in just a second as we go through this, but kind of a specialized part of the temporal lobe. The occipital lobe is going to be located towards the posterior part of the brain, and this is the visual processing center of the brain. It contains most of the anatomical region of the visual cortex, so all of your vision is going to go through this particular area. Moving on to the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is located at the front of each of the cerebral hemispheres and positioned right in front of the parietal lobe and above and in front of the temporal lobe. So this is kind of going to be right behind your forehead. This is where your primary motor cortex is, so it controls the voluntary movements of specific body parts. And your frontal lobe also contains most of the dopamine delicate neurons located in the cerebrum. And dopamine, your system of dopamine is associated with reward, attention, short-term memory tasks, planning, and motivation. So all of that's going to develop or be controlled in that frontal lobe. It consists of the prefrontal cortex, which is located in the most anterior section of the frontal lobe, and this is critical for one's working memory and executive control, which helps keep goals and complex tasks organized. Going to the parietal lobe. It's located above the occipital lobe and behind the frontal lobe. And its job is going to integrate sensory information among various modalities, including spatial sense, navigation. The main sensory receptive area for the sense of touch is located in this particular area of your brain. And the major sensory inputs from the skin, touch, temperature, and pain receptors relay through the thalamus to the parietal lobe to be analyzed. Also involved in language processing. There are 2 main gyres located in the cerebrum. So we're going to start with the precentral gyrus, which is the primary motor cortex. And ultimately, this this part of the brain is the part that controls all of your movement. So the cells here each correspond to a part of the body, and then it controls its movement. Next to that is the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary sensory cortex. The post-central gyrus's function is like the other side is motor area. This one is sensory information. So its job is to process sensory information such as touch and information about where the body is and which direction it is moving. So it kind of analyzes your senses. There are also two association areas that are found in the cerebrum. So association areas produce a meaningful experience of the world. It helps us to interact effectively and support abstract thinking and language. So the parietal, the temporal, the occipital lobes, they're all located in the posterior part of the cortex. They organize the sensory information into a coherent model of our environment centered on our body image. So basically what these association areas do is they combine all of the information, our motor information, our sensory information, in order to integrate them into something that is meaningful to us and that we can use, like our perception of where we are at and what we are feeling. Continuing with the cerebrum, the front part is the prefrontal cortex, and this is going to be implicated in planning complex cognitive behavior, your personality, decision-making, and moderating social behavior. And then we have two areas that are specific for language. Broca's area is going to be involved in our development of speech, and Wernicke's area is going to be involved in our comprehension of speech. Moving on to the cerebellum. So this is the posterior view. This is looking at it from the side or lateral view. So here is the cerebellum down here in green. The cerebellum is the major structure of the hindbrain that is located very close to the brainstem, which would be right here. This part of the brain is responsible for coordinating voluntary movement. So any movement that you can control is controlled in this particular area. It is also responsible for a number of functions, including motor skills such as balance, coordination, and posture. Then we have the diencephalon region, which is located right here beneath the cerebral hemispheres, and then the brain stems and the three parts of the brain stem. So here is looking at it from a medial section, so it's cut in half so we can see this. The diencephalon region relays sensory information between brain regions and controls many of our autonomic functions of the peripheral nervous system. So it's going to control those things that we don't have to think about. It also plays a role in sense impulses throughout the body, endocrine function, motor function. It helps maintain our homeostasis through various activities, hearing, vision, smell, and taste, and also plays a role in touch perception. Brainstem is going to be right here. You can see here the pons and the medulla oblongata. These two areas are visible on this particular diagram. So here's the medulla. It's going to be the lower part of the brain stem. It's a cone-shaped mass of neurons, and it is responsible for your involuntary functions. So things that you don't think about, from vomiting to sneezing to swallowing, all of those things are going to be controlled by the medulla, and eventually this is going to join with your spinal cord. So this is a really important structure in your brain that allows you to do the things that you need to do without you having to think about it. Your pons is the area in blue there, so it is going to be right in between the medulla oblongata and the thalamus, and it plays a really, really critical role in generating the respiratory rhythm of breathing. It does some other things too, but that's really its main job. This is going to control your respiratory rate. The midbrain is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep, wakefulness, alertness, and also temperature regulation. So oftentimes these will all get lumped into the brainstem, your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla, but they are three distinct structures. Your thalamus, which is here in green. So your thalamus is a small structure within the brain. It's located just above the brainstem between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain. And its job is to relay motor and sensory signals to the cerebral cortex. So it almost acts as the go-between. This is going to be where all information will pass through. connecting the brain stem to the cerebrum. This is the hypothalamus, a region of the forebrain below the thalamus, and its job is to coordinate both the autonomic nervous system and the activity of the pituitary gland. So things that it does would include controlling body temperature, thirst, hunger, and also it is involved in sleep and emotional activities. Remember that your pituitary gland is divided into anterior and a posterior part. So this is showing you the anterior pituitary gland, or the front portion of the pituitary gland. And this is, the pituitary gland is called the master gland. Hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary influence growth, sexual development, skin pigmentation, thyroid function, adrenocortical function. It basically controls all of the other hormonal activity that's going on. So it's a small structure, but really important structure. Here are the superior and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi plays an important role in the visual pathway, while the inferior is important to auditory pathways. These two structures as a whole are thought to help orientate the head and eyes towards something that's seen and here. So it allows us kind of to react to vision and sound. Here's the hippocampus. It's a complex brain structure that's embedded deep into the temporal lobe. It has a major role in learning and memory. It is very vulnerable to damage, so oftentimes if you have a head injury and this part gets damaged, then your ability to learn and remember can be affected. And the amygdala is an area of your brain that is responsible for processing fearful and threatening stimuli. So when you are feeling threatened or very afraid, this will help generate or interpret that information. The fornix is a structure that is connected to the hippocampus and again plays a role with the hippocampus in memory and is part of the limbic system, which is your emotional brain. Again, looking at the brain from an inferior viewpoint, you can see some of these structures again: frontal lobe, temporal lobe, your pons, your medulla. Looking at some of these structures from a lateral viewpoint, fornix, we talked about that. Just some different viewpoints and some more structures. Looking at the ventricular system, the choroid plexus is going to be responsible for producing most of the cerebral spinal fluid. So this is going to be the fluid that surrounds and sits in different rooms or sections in your brain that help keep the brain buoyant. And then help provide a shock absorbing fluid around to protect the brain. So all of that cerebral spinal fluid is made in these two particular areas. The ventricular system is a set of communicating cavities within the brain, or small little rooms. These structures are responsible for the production, the transport, and the removal of cerebrospinal fluid, which again helps bathe the brain and the spinal cord. In total, there are 4 ventricles: right and left lateral ventricles, third ventricle, and fourth ventricles. And you can see where those are kind of located. The cerebral aqueduct is going to send cerebrospinal fluid to the third ventricle, and the central spinal canal is going to send cerebrospinal fluid to the spinal cavity. The third ventricle is going to get its cerebrospinal fluid from the cerebral aqueduct, and then the central spinal canal is going to then send cerebrospinal fluid down to the spinal cord. Here is another diagram showing you the different ventricles, the cerebral aqueduct, the central canal, and then looking at it as an actual structure. And then the choroid plexus, which is going to produce that cerebrospinal fluid, would be located right there in red. The subarachnoid space is going to basically bathe the brain with the cerebrospinal fluid, so it's just the area that's going to hold this fluid. The cerebral sinuses are going to be a network of openings or cavities that lies between the layers of the dura mater that are going to collect oxygen depleted blood to then get delivered back down to the lungs where it can pick up oxygen. So here's a picture of some of those sinuses, their locations, and then looking at the location of gray matter and white matter. So these are the two types of tissues that are found in the nervous system. Gray matter is distinguished from white matter in that it contains a lot of cell bodies and not a lot of myelinated axons. So gray matter is mostly cell bodies, and white matter contains mostly myelinated axons. Okay, so when you're thinking about the neuron, think back to, the cell body and then the axon. Neurons are gray matter, mostly cell bodies. White matter, mostly myelinated neurons. So in short, the axons of the white matter, okay, so they're going to send the information. And the dendrites and the cell bodies of the gray matter are going to process the information. So they work together, but you can definitely see a visual difference between the two, and that's because there are the collection of two different parts of the neuron. And you can see here's gray matter, here's going to be white matter. Looks gray, kind of looks white. The location of some of those ventricles that we talked about, again, the longitudinal fissure is going to be the big one that's going to kind of cut the brain into two halves. And if you have questions about anything, don't be afraid to ask. Obviously, your textbook's going to go more into detail about the various functions of these parts, but it just gives you a general idea. Have a fantastic day.